Okay, so welcome everybody. My name is Levi. I'm an independent Edgar Allan Poe scholar and Rhode Island native with a focus on Poe's connection to Providence and his relationship, of course, with the local poetess, Sarah Helen Whitman. I've had a long-standing interest in Poe since age 12. I created a walking tour of Poe's Providence, which debuted in 2021, as well as a website, edgarallanpoeri.com, which compiles Poe and Whitman's history in Rhode Island. This presentation serves as sort of a virtual version of the walking tour as we explore locations significant to their courtship and rekindle their passionate romance. So thank you to the Knight Memorial Library for hosting this program and Acadia for making it happen. Okay, so Providence, as seen in 1848. At least in my opinion, it's often overlooked in Poe's biography, but his time here was actually quite crucial, as you'll learn, especially his relationship with Sarah Helen Whitman. She became his biggest defender after his death in 1849, helping shape his legacy until her own death in 1878. So my goal is to help Providence acknowledge its important connection to one of America's most famous writers and to help celebrate Sarah Helen Whitman's legacy both inside and outside of her relationship with Poe. And as I briefly mentioned, pictured here is Providence as it looked in 1848, which was during Poe's extent of his visits. And of course, since Sarah Helen Whitman was responsible for Poe's extended time here in Providence, allow me to begin with her. So in this photograph is Sarah Helen Whitman, taken by the daguerreotypist Joseph White in 1853, right here in Providence. So Sarah Helen Power was born in her grandfather's house on January 19th, 1803. This was 6 years to the day before Edgar Allan Poe. They shared the same birthday. Her parents, pictured here, are Nicholas and Anna Power. Nicholas owned a merchant business in Providence, and Anna was a homemaker. Sarah Helen was the second child of 3 girls and was certainly the brightest child, teaching herself Latin, French, and German while often skipping school to read Shakespeare and pursue her own studies. When the War of 1812 put Nicholas out of business, he set out to sea to make his living. He was captured by a British fleet shortly after his departure, and he was held a prisoner of war. He was presumed dead when his family stopped hearing from him. Shortly after Nicholas's departure from home, Anna Power and her daughters moved into the south side, which would have been the left half of this house, a dwelling house built in the late 18th century. And this house still stands today at 88 Benefit Street. It was in this home that Sarah Helen Whitman spent most of her life, and perhaps more importantly, the house witnessed her romance with Poe. It was purchased by the Episcopal Church in the early 1900s, and it's still owned by them today. In the 1950s, it underwent renovations that removed much of the originality of the interior, and it was turned into 5 separate apartment units, 1 at the bottom and 4 in the top 2 levels, which are rented out to the public. A fun note to add is that the color of the house is similar, not exact, but similar to the color when Whitman lived there. She remarked that she hated the red exterior color of the house, but the beauty and the elegance of the interior woodwork made up for it. And here's where the story gets a bit strange for the Power family. So Nicholas was released from his imprisonment from the British about 2 years after he was captured. So he decided to continue his life at sea without notifying his family that he had survived. Nearly 20 years later, he returned home to his widow, and I put that in quotations, in a bizarre attempt to resume his family life. Anna obviously did not receive him well, removing her widow's bonnet and promptly beating him with it until he was forced out of the house. Anna dealt with her husband only one time after this, and this is when his body lied in state in the home at 88 Benefit Street during his wake. Their youngest daughter, Susan, who suffered from an unspecified mental illness, never even met her father. She was still in the womb when her father had left. So she was born shortly after he left home, and having an knack for poetry like her older sister, Sarah Helen, Susan wrote this couplet, which kind of became the sole monument to her father's legacy. And it goes, Mr. Nicholas Power left home in a sailing vessel bound for St. Kitts. When he returned, he frightened his family out of their wits. The Power's oldest daughter, Rebecca, died a few years before his return, and as for Sarah Helen, well, she had little time to concern herself with her father's strange behavior. She was occupied building a life of her very own. In 1824, Sarah Helen became engaged to this man here, John Winslow Whitman, who was a law student at Brown University, and they finally married in 1828. After their marriage, she moved with him to Boston, where she pursued her writing through his connections with the Ladies' Album and the Times. However, John Whitman passed away from a cold within 5 years of their marriage, leaving Sarah Helen Whitman a widow. She returned to live with her mother and sister Susan in Providence, where she spent the rest of her life. But through her writings and contributions to publications like the Daily Journal, which became the Providence Journal that we know today and still read, Whitman became a productive activist, a proponent of women's suffrage, a force in favor of abolition. Her literary criticisms deemed her one of the first female critics in the country, right next to Margaret Fuller. And although Sarah Helen Whitman lived in Providence the rest of her life, she was well-traveled, traveling to Europe and all over the United States, and she would write little travel logs that she sent to the Providence Journal, and they would be published there. So she kind of became like a travel correspondent as well as an activist through her writing. One thing that a lot of locals here in Providence know about Sarah Helen Whitman, if nothing at all, is that she was heavily involved in the spiritualism movement, which occurred shortly after her romance with Poe, so around 1849, 1850. She frequently hosted and attended seances in Providence, and in true goth fashion, which was way ahead of her time, she wore a wooden coffin pendant around her neck, and she was just enthralled by the macabre. There's no wonder why. Of course, she was drawn to the dark and fascinating fiction of Edgar Allan Poe, whose works were well read and well known to her. On reading Poe's works, Whitman commented, quote, "I can never forget the impressions I felt in reading a story of his for the first time. I experienced a sensation of such intense horror that I dared neither look at anything he had written nor ever utter his name. By degrees, this terror took the character of fascination. I devoured with a half-reluctant and fearful avidity every line that fell from his pen," end quote. And so the photo depicted here is of Sarah Helen Whitman, taken by her friend, who was a photographer in Providence named William Coleman. And this was taken sometime after 1856, and it shows Sarah Helen Whitman in full garb, ready for a seance, veiled and everything. Okay, so now I'll take a brief moment to get into Poe a little bit before I explain exactly how their worlds collided. So, as you can see by this painting of Poe that was rendered around 1845, he was quite a refined gentleman at this time, much different than the haggard man with a mustache we're used to seeing. Poe's literary career really started to take off in the mid to late 1830s. While working as editor and contributor for multiple magazines, Poe became a harsh literary critic, earning himself the nickname the Tomahawk Man. He considered himself a poet, but his short stories sold quite well. Poe invented the detective genre as we know it today with the publication of his story, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, published in 1841. He's credited with being a pioneer of science fiction. He wrote comedies, he wrote essays, and those essays ranged in topic from interior decorating to the origin of the universe. And of course, he wrote horror stories, so the public loved to hate and hated to love his horror stories. But it was actually a poem that made Poe a household name and really solidified his place in literary circles. And this is where I quiz the audience. Is there anyone here that could guess what poem made Poe an instant hit, an instant success? Yes?
Was it The Raven?
Sure was. The Raven. Great guess. Couldn't stump you there. It was published in the New York Evening Mirror in January of 1845. And so it was July of that same year, 1845, that Poe came to Providence for the very first time in his life. And he was invited by his friend, Francis Osgood, who's depicted here. And Osgood was an established poetess in her own right. She was staying in the city at the time, and she invited Poe here to visit. And on the evening of that visit, the two took a walk together on Benefit Street, likely from Osgood's hotel, probably the Golden Ball Inn, which was located on Benefit Street. It's no longer standing today, but it would put them in the right location for a stroll north, which would have led them to Sarah Helen Whitman's house at 88 Benefit Street. So as they approached the house, Osgood happened to be a close friend of Sarah Helen Whitman, and she offered to introduce Poe to her while he was visiting the city. But Poe declined an introduction so adamantly that it actually provoked them into a little quarrel. But later, Poe escorted Osgood back to her hotel, and he walked the city alone, traveling the same route that he did with Osgood just hours before. When he again approached Whitman's residence, he glanced down the hill and saw a veiled woman clad in a white shawl, a veil, and a white muslin dress, and she was tending her rose garden in the backyard of her home. She must have looked ethereal under the moonlight, and that woman, of course, was Sarah Helen Whitman, and perhaps it was at this moment that Poe regretted declining that introduction to her on his visit to Providence. But Whitman left a perpetual mark on Poe's mind, there's no doubt, although he didn't visit her and meet her on that first visit in 1845. Their visit was meant to be. In 1847, Poe had lost his wife, who's photoed here in a post-mortem watercolor painting. Excuse me. And she had died of tuberculosis at age 24. And at this point, Poe turned to alcohol, as a lot of people often know about Poe, is that he did have a vice with alcoholism. And this kind of softened the wounds on his heart, so to speak. But his drinking became a public spectacle. His alcoholism was seen as more of a character flaw and a lack of self-control rather than an unfortunate disease as we know it to be today. And however, his relationship with the bottle, so to speak, is quite exaggerated today in his biography. His bouts were very far and few between, and it didn't take much alcohol to really send him into a stupor. And people who had saw him and came across him during these binges thought he was much more intoxicated than he really was, that he had consumed much more than he really did. And scandal just followed him everywhere he went, through literary circles and through his professional life. His reputation just plummeted. And so despite all this, he still continued to write. He still continued to publish some of his greatest, most prolific works. And so in February of 1848, having absolutely no idea that Poe had saw her 3 years prior, Sarah Helen Whitman published a very flirtatious valentine to Poe in the Home Journal, which was titled To Edgar A. Poe. She later retitled it The Raven. And this was after she submitted the poem to a literary party where it wasn't read because of Poe's reputation. So when Frances Osgood, the woman who initially brought Poe to Providence and was going to introduce Poe to Whitman, when she saw the poem published, she wrote to Whitman in a forewarning kind of note where she said, quote, "I see by the Home Journal that your beautiful invocation has reached the raven in his eyrie, and I suppose ere this he has swooped upon your little dovecot in Providence. May Providence protect you if he has. He is in truth a glorious devil with large heart and brain." End quote. But Whitman disregarded this message. Poe was quite flattered by the unsolicited attention that he had received from Sarah Helen Whitman, so he tore out a poem from his published collection of works that conveniently bore her name in the title, her nickname, that is, Helen. Poe sent her that poem anonymously without signature, and Whitman, she didn't reply. She probably knew who it was from, but she didn't want to stir anything up at that moment, so she left it be. So then Poe wrote a tailored poem just for her, and again, sent this poem anonymously. This poem didn't even have a title, but it later became known as Poe's second title, To Helen. And the opening stanzas of that poem go like this. "I saw thee once only, years ago. I must not say how many, but not many. It was a July midnight, and from out a full-orbed moon that, like thine own soul soaring, sought a precipitate pathway up through heaven, there fell a silvery silken veil of light with quietude and sultriness and slumber upon the upturned faces of 1,000 roses that grew in an enchanted garden. So after Poe had sent her this letter without any kind of acknowledgement, he decided to get a letter of introduction to Whitman written by a mutual friend, a fellow writer named Maria McIntosh, and he headed straight to Providence after this. On September 21st, 1848, Poe called on Whitman at her home on Benefit Street and handed her this letter of introduction, seen in the photos here taken during my visit to the John Hay Library when I got to handle this note myself. The John Hay Library houses the bulk of Whitman's papers today. And it was honestly quite surreal to hold this letter in my hand that traveled in Poe's coat pocket from New York to Providence, where it was then handed to Sarah Helen Whitman, which ignited their romance. And then, of course, from Whitman's hands, it went to the John Hay Library, the collection of Brown University. So to be able to handle this note really was such a surreal experience. It was like handling a piece of Poe and Sarah Helen Whitman history, truly. And as you can see by the envelope, it is addressed to Mrs. Whitman by Maria McIntosh with Edgar A. Poe at the bottom there. And it's really quite surreal to still have this history relating to the romance. And so the following day, Poe is introduced to Whitman's friends during a gathering. Oh, I'm sorry. I should note before I talk about that, is during their first meeting, Poe and Whitman, they strolled places like St. John's Cathedral, which is located right in back of Sarah Helen Whitman's home on Benefit Street, as well as Swan Point Cemetery, too. These were two places that housed their romance. And there's another place, the Providence Athenaeum, that we're going to talk about in a little bit. But on that first meeting, Poe does what any sensible man would do on a first date, and he proposes marriage to Sarah Helen Whitman. And it was likely at Swan Point that Poe proposed to Sarah Helen Whitman, at least for the first time. Now, of course, he would have asked for her hand in marriage multiple times during their courtship, but this was the first time, and unsurprisingly, she declines. And so the following day, after that first meeting, Poe was introduced to some of Whitman's friends during a gathering in Providence at her home, and Susan Barney was among those friends, and she recalled a peculiar moment that occurred at the party. So Mrs. Barney says, quote, Poe and Mrs. Whitman sat across the room from each other. All present were drawn toward Poe, whose eyes were gleaming and whose utterance was most eloquent. His eyes were fixed on Mrs. Whitman. Of a sudden, the company perceived that Poe and Helen were greatly agitated. Simultaneously, both arose from their chairs and walked toward the center of the room. Meeting, he held her in her arms, kissed her. They stood for a moment. Then he led her to her seat. There was a dead silence through all this strange proceeding. End quote. So from this description, you can really imagine this magnetism between them. It was almost otherworldly. So after a few days of being in Providence, Poe returned home to New York. And in a letter from Whitman to Poe about a week after, she wrote, quote, You are not perhaps aware that I am many years older than yourself. I fear you do not know it, and that if you had known it, you would not have felt for me as you do. I find that I cannot now tell you all that I promised. I can only say to you that had I youth and health and beauty, I would live for you and die with you. Now, were I to allow myself to love you, I could only enjoy a bright, brief hour of rapture and die. End quote. Little dramatic, I agree. Whitman had a heart condition that she feared would kill her at any given moment. Now, of course, when she wrote this, she was about 45 years old. Poe was about 39. You know, not really common talk for people of that age, but Whitman truly believed her heart condition would kill her. she actually carried a bottle of ether and a handkerchief. And ether is the equivalent to chloroform today, so it's a pretty heavy anesthetic. And this was prescribed to her by a doctor. And in moments of great distress or anxiety, she would douse the handkerchief with the ether and make sure she had a soft place to land, and she would inhale the ether. And this would supposedly calm her heart back down and help relax her again. Whitman used this condition to kind of discourage Poe's romantic pursuit, basically telling him that she couldn't be a normal wife or a normal companion to him without abruptly dying. So Poe's response to this was almost as good. And he says, quote, "At your feet, if you so willed it, I would cast from me forever all merely human desire and clothe myself in the glory of a pure, calm, and unexacting affection. I would comfort you, soothe you, tranquilize you. My love, my faith should instill into your bosom a preternatural calm. You would rest from care, from all worldly agitation. You would get better and finally well. And if not, Helen, if you died, then at least would I clasp your dear hand in death and willingly, oh, joyfully, joyfully, joyfully go down with you into the night of the grave." End quote. So did you expect anything less from Edgar Allan Poe? And so, Poe visited Providence on and off over the next 3 months, so from September to December of 1848, while he was courting Whitman, staying in town for varying intervals of time. On November 9th, Poe was captured in this daguerreotype, which is undoubtedly the most celebrated image of him that exists today. It was taken in Providence at the studio of Masery and Hartshorn on Westminster Street. But it was actually an assistant photographer named Edward Manchester who took the photo. Excuse me. Sarah Helen Whitman was the one who coined the name Ultima Thule for this image, and she took the phrase that Poe used in his poem Dreamland, where he says, "I have reached these lands but newly from an ultimate dim Thule, from a wild, weird clime that lieth sublime, out of space, out of time." And Ultima Thule is a Latin phrase, and it translates essentially to extreme limits of travel and discovery. Certainly an appropriate ode to this image. But Poe continued his pursuit of Whitman's hand in marriage, but she still turned him down. She still turned down these proposals. And Poe's mental and physical health really spiraled at this time. And unfortunately, he did attempt suicide by consuming 1 of 2 ounces of laudanum that he had obtained here in Providence. Now, laudanum is a tincture of opium and alcohol, equivalent to morphine today. It was mostly used in the 19th century as a painkiller, but Poe took this drug in an attempt to take his own life. And so he boarded a train to Boston, and upon arrival, he took 1 ounce of the drug, and he intended to take the second ounce, the second dose, and finish the job, so to speak, after mailing a love letter / suicide note to not Sarah Helen Whitman, get this, a married woman from Lowell, Massachusetts, Nancy Annie Richmond. This ordeal is worthy of a whole presentation in itself, but Annie here would play a pretty significant role in Poe's final months of his life. Fortunately for Poe, he had miscalculated the strength of the morphine, of the laudanum, and that first ounce that he took made him so ill that his body rejected it. He couldn't even take the second dose, and he just became so sick that he had to lay out in a hotel for a couple days until the effects of the drug wore off. So this fortunately spared his life. And so that whole occurrence was 4 days, again, before he sat for that image there, the Ultima Thule, right in Providence. But it doesn't stop there. So 4 days after a suicide attempt and 1 day after a pretty heavy drinking binge that happened the night before the photo was taken at the Earl House. So the Earl House is seen in that engraving when it was actually the American House. And the building is no longer standing, but you can find it today adjacent to the First Baptist Church on Steeple Street. And at some point during the evening in the bar room of his hotel, Poe encountered a man that we know only as Mr. McFarlane. And this McFarlane guy evidently was an admirer of Poe, and he drank with Poe throughout the night and looked after him that whole evening. And in the morning, McFarlane insisted that Poe go to the daguerreotype studio and have his picture taken. And McFarlane paid for the photo, and that photo became the most iconic of Poe ever taken, and that was right here in Providence. And again, 4 days after a suicide attempt, 1 day after a pretty heavy drinking binge. So that gives you a little bit of context behind the image and why it's so iconic today. You know, when we think of someone writing works such as Poe wrote, we think of a man that looks like this, but this wasn't really reflective of how Poe really looked, you know, haggard, sickly, heavy bags under his eyes. He was really just going through a really bad time. And so after the sitting, Poe made his way frantically to Whitman's home on Benefit Street to see her, and she recounted that he arrived in great distress, quote, calling upon me to save him from some terrible impending doom. The tones of his voice were appalling, and they rang through the house. Never have I heard anything so awful, even to sublimity. It was long before I could nerve myself to see him. When my mother requested me to have a cup of strong coffee prepared for him, he clung to me so frantically as to tear away a piece of the muslin dress that I wore. End quote. So Whitman's mother was even concerned by Poe's behavior. She called a local physician named Dr. Oakey, who actually lived on Benefit Street, to come examine him at the house. Dr. Oakey gave some kind of broad diagnosis, you know, like congestion of the brain or something, which really just meant that Poe needed to take a nap or something. And he also suggested that Poe stay at the home of a friend to have a proper eye kept on him, and so that he would stay away from any kind of stimulants, alcohol, drugs, anything of the sort. And so that friend that decided to take Poe into his home was this gentleman right here, William Jewett Pabody. Pabody was actually a friend of Sarah Helen Whitman's, but during Poe's visits to Providence and during his courtship with Sarah Helen Whitman, Pabody loomed around, and he was kind of in the background at all times. It's kind of undetermined whether or not Pabody was really a true friend of Poe's or maybe an enemy, if he was really helping the romance or sabotaging it. But Poe did write a letter to Pabody thanking him for his hospitality and his friendship. And so about 4 days after Poe sat for the Ultima Thule daguerreotype, he returned to the same studio to have this daguerreotype taken as an engagement gift to Sarah Helen Whitman. So you did hear me right. Sometime between November 9th and the 13th, Sarah Helen Whitman finally agreed to marry Poe. And here in this daguerreotype, as you can see it in its original frame that was restored within the last decade or so by Brown University. It's been called the Whitman daguerreotype because it was in Sarah Helen Whitman's possession for quite some time after Poe had gifted it to her. And Poe considered this photo the best likeness he ever had, but Whitman disagreed. So in an 1874 letter written to Poe biographer John Henry Ingram, she said, quote, "This picture of mine has been hidden away all these years because I thought it did not represent him truly. But many persons who have seen it lately think it has the best expression of him yet taken." End quote. So this photo marked the end of a very harrowing fortnight for Poe in Providence, but things were finally looking up. While Whitman agreed to marry him, she had conditions. One, that he must abstain from alcohol. It was a vice she knew he struggled with on and off throughout his life, but especially during his brief time in Providence. Her other condition was that she get her mother to consent to the union, that they would receive her mother's blessing. And this is the same woman that said she'd rather see her daughter dead than with Edgar Allan Poe. But surprisingly, her mother consented to the union with a condition of her own. And I don't know about you, but this very conditional engagement is already a very bad sign. But Whitman, of course, had to forfeit her inheritance so that her husband-to-be couldn't get his hands on it once they were married. So this was Whitman's mother, Anna Power. This was her condition for the union to take place. And that inheritance equates in today's money to over $200,000. So quite a significant sum of money, nothing to wince at. Whitman signed over this small fortune and prepared to marry Poe sometime in December. So things were really starting to look up for their romance. And so to briefly go back to the photo, it was taken in Providence, of course, at the same studio where the previously mentioned Ultima Thule was taken just days before. And as you can see in the two photos, the difference in Poe's manner and his expression are quite profound. You know, in the second photo, he's looking up a little bit. He might be a little bit more put together, still missing a few buttons on his shirt, but we'll ignore that. And he's really quite pleased that Whitman's finally agreeing to marry him. And the Whitman daguerreotype is the only known photograph of Poe that he actually commissioned himself. And as I mentioned before, he thought it was the best photo of him ever taken. On the contrary, the Ultima Thule photo obviously captured Poe during one of the most horrific points of his life. And so we only know of Poe sitting on 6 different occasions to have a daguerreotype taken. So it's quite significant that Providence served as the place for 2 of those occasions, capturing Poe at his very worst and his very best. So the Providence Athenaeum, located just a short distance south of Whitman's home on Benefit Street, was a library established in 1836. It's the 4th oldest library in the United States. And when its doors opened, it operated as a member-funded library that was open to the public. And today it runs under that same model. So anyone is welcome to visit the library and browse the books, but you can't check any of those books out unless you are a member. The library was the perfect sanctuary for Poe and Whitman, and they spent many hours within the walls of this really amazing institution. And it was at the Athenaeum that Whitman read an unsigned poem in the American Review that began, "The skies, they were ashen and sober. The leaves, they were crisped and sere. The leaves, they were withering and sere. It was night in the lonesome October of my most immemorial year. It was hard by the dim lake of Auber in the misty mid-region of Weir. It was down by the dank tarn of Auber in the ghoul-haunted woodland of Weir." And that poem's title was Ulalume. It was an instant favorite of Whitman's, and she had asked everyone she knew if they had read it, and she vainly questioned who the author was. One morning while she was with Poe at the Athenaeum, she asked him if he had read it. Without saying a word, he grabbed the very volume off the shelf in the alcove where they were sitting, and he opened up to the poem. He then took a pencil and signed his name at the bottom of the page, defacing library property, mind you. And that's a photo of the signature right there. The Athenaeum, of course, they are very glad that Edgar Allan Poe decided to deface one of their library books. They have it in their special collections today. It remained on the shelf for about 20 years until Whitman remembered the occurrence while she was corresponding with Poe's biographer, John Henry Ingram, and she went back to the Athenaeum to secure it into good hands. And from Whitman's hands to the librarians, they have kept it in their special collections, and you can view it today by request. And faintly, Poe's lightly penciled-in name is still at the bottom of Ulalume, his previously unsigned contribution to the American Whig Review. You'll also find at the Athenaeum this beautiful oil painting of Sarah Helen Whitman, painted a few years after she became a widow by the artist Cyphus Giovanni Thompson. And Whitman is depicted wearing her pink widow's bonnet, which is somewhat of an emblem signifying her rebellion against social norms. I think a white widow's bonnet, or perhaps even black, would have been a little bit more customary, but she decided pink was more her color if she was going to become a widow. And it's also worth mentioning that among the Athenaeum's pantheon of life-sized busts, you'll see the sculpted face of Edgar Allan Poe perched right above the entryway below the windows of the art room, which features the aforementioned portrait of Whitman. The bust of Poe was actually duplicated from one in my personal collection, and in 2019 I conspired with the Athenaeum to get the bust to their library so that Poe could have his proper place at the Athenaeum. And you can see the portrait of Whitman through the windows right above the bust, and it's as if their romance is still kind of playfully brewing at the Athenaeum today. So, Edgar Allan Poe gave a lecture called The Poetic Principle at Howard's Hall on December 20th, 1848. This is an engraving of Howard's Hall as it looked in 1847, and it was packed with nearly 2,000 people from all over Providence, all over Rhode Island. And during the lecture, Poe recited poetry, which included selections from his own works, but directing his performance at his fiancée, Sarah Helen Whitman, who sat in the very front row. The lecture so impressed Whitman that she planned an immediate wedding for Christmas Day, which was just a few days ahead. The site of Howard's Hall, unfortunately, is no longer standing, but the location of it today can be found adjacent to City Hall downtown. And so the wedding was to take place at St. John's Cathedral, the same church mentioned before that's located in the back of Whitman's home on Benefit Street. Poe traveled home to Fordham, New York, to get his affairs in order and tell his mother, which was the mother of his late wife, whom he very much considered his own mother, the exciting news. He wrote to Whitman in anticipation of the wedding, quote, "Keep up heart, for all will go well. My mother sends her dearest love and says she will return good for evil and treat you much better than your mother has treated me." End quote. So Poe was clearly still resentful of Whitman's family's opposition to their union. He even told one of his friends in New York that he doubted the marriage would actually take place. Now, you do remember the condition Whitman set for the marriage to happen, right? The one about Poe's drinking. Well, 2 days before the wedding, an anonymous note was given to Sarah Helen Whitman while she was at the Athenaeum with Poe. The note said that he had a glass of wine at his hotel and was drunk. And so it was that evening at the house where it all began on Benefit Street that Whitman confronted Poe about the note, and she called off the wedding. This was their last conversation. The stress of the matter was just so intense for Whitman that she inhaled her ether-soaked handkerchief and fell on the sofa. Poe apparently carried her to another sofa that was closer to the fireplace, covered her with a shawl, and he knelt by her side while tightly gripping her hand. She came to a little bit, looked into his eyes, and said, "What can I say, Edgar?" "Say that you love me," he replied. "I love you." Whitman uttered those final words before losing consciousness. And at that point, her mother had seen enough and passive-aggressively reminded Poe that the next train out of Providence was leaving in about half an hour, and he better not miss it. William Pabody, who was present for the whole ordeal, escorted Poe to the train station, and Poe left Providence, never looking back. The following month, Poe wrote to Whitman in a cold letter where he addressed her as Madam and Mrs. W., very starkly contrasted nicknames as opposed to his Helen and his Sweet and all the romantic things he was calling her during their courtship. In the letter, he blamed her mother for everything that went wrong. This excerpt is a good example of the overall tone, where he says, "Heaven knows that I would shrink from wounding or grieving you. I blame no one but your mother. Mr. Pabody will tell you all. May heaven shield you from all ill." So apparently on the way to the train station, he kind of unburdened himself to Pabody, who listened to all of it. Whitman thought it was best not to reply to this letter as the wounds were still so fresh. Perhaps she thought time would heal those wounds, but she was wrong. Poe is dead only 9 months later in Baltimore under totally mysterious circumstances. To this day, we still don't know how Poe died on that fateful October in Baltimore. But life after Providence, at least, was starting to look up for Poe. He continued his successful lecture tour and rekindled an old romance with Elmira Shelton, his childhood sweetheart in Richmond, Virginia. And they became engaged in the late summer of 1849. And here is a daguerreotype around 1850 of Elmira. Poe left Richmond for New York, intending to bring his mother back to Richmond for the wedding. He took a steamboat from Richmond to Baltimore, where he was then to take the train north to New York. But Sadly, he never made it out of Baltimore. After going missing for 5 days, he was found disoriented and in distress, as he was described, at Gunner's Hall Tavern, which was doubling as a polling place that day. He was rescued by a local friend, Joseph Snodgrass, and was taken to this hospital here, where he lingered for about 4 days in and out of consciousness, never really able to explain his disappearance or the condition that he was in. On the night before his death, he repeatedly called out the name Reynolds over and over again before dying on October 7, 1849. His final words were, "Lord, help my poor soul." The hospital where he died at is still standing today, except now it's private residences. But at the time, it was the Washington Medical College, then Church Home Hospital, and now I think it's called Church Home Apartments. And that's in Baltimore. He was hastily buried in an unmarked grave with only about 7 mourners. His death remains a mystery today, as I said, with numerous theories but no definitive answers or cause of death. Photoed here is a marker which marks his original grave site. 26 years after he was buried in 1849, Poe and his mother-in-law, Maria Clem, were exhumed from their graves and reburied under this grand monument that was erected to him in 1875. His wife, Virginia's remains, were exhumed in New York and finally joined her husband's and her mother's in Baltimore about 10 years after the monument was established in 1875. And so today, when you visit Poe's grave, you'll go to the Westminster burial grounds and you'll find two graves. You'll find the one in the front, which is where his remains are actually under, with his mother-in-law and his wife, and then another grave marker in the back, which marks his original burial place. Sarah Helen Whitman lived another 30 years after Poe, becoming a staunch defender of his reputation. Poe's literary rival, seen here, Rufus Griswold, published an awful obituary of Poe and a slanderous memoir. Whitman, in response, published her own book in 1860, which was titled Edgar Poe and His Critics, where she directly responded to the lies that Griswold had published about Poe. She also corresponded with his earliest biographers, even while on her own deathbed, really trying to ensure an accurate portrayal of the man that she once loved so many years ago, despite the tumultuous end that came to their romance. So we owe her for her part in Poe's legacy just as much as we owe Poe for her legacy. Had it not been for her relationship with Edgar Allan Poe, I think Sarah Helen Whitman would have been one of those figures that kind of slipped through the cracks a little bit. Most people know her today for her relationship with Poe, but upon further exploration of her life and works, you'll realize that she really contributed so much more. So after her mother's death in 1858, Sarah Helen Whitman cared for her mentally ill younger sister Susan in this house, which is located on Power Street today. They had moved from their home on Benefit Street that served them for so long. After the house was sold, the new owners decided to independently occupy the house and not keep it as a dwelling house. So Whitman had to find somewhere else to live, which is how they came to be in this house that is, again, on Power Street, but it was moved from Benevolent Street, actually. So originally it was at 39 Benevolent Street, and Brown University around 1950 physically moved the house to save it from demolition. So today you'll find it at 140 Power Street. And Susan's condition made life very difficult for Sarah Helen Whitman, mostly due to her violent outbursts. They lived here until Susan's death in 1877, after which Whitman wrote her last poem, In Memoriam, which was a tribute to her dear departed sister. Now that Whitman was alone and declining quite rapidly in her own health at 74 years old, Whitman, despite being free from the many burdens that consumed her time, which was caring for her sister, said she was just too ill to enjoy it. In January of 1878, Whitman received an offer from her friend, Charlotte Daly, to move in with her family in their home shown here on Brown Street. Whitman graciously accepted this offer, auctioning off most of her furniture and household items before moving in. The Dalys cared for their ailing friend over the next 5 months. But in her final months of life, with the assistance of the Daly daughters, Whitman prepared her poetry for a posthumous publication. They helped her transcribe letters to friends and Poe biographers, which demonstrated Whitman's continued devotion to Poe's memory up until her final moments of life. And photoed here is Whitman, again taken by her friend William Coleman, but undated. We can roughly approximate the date somewhere after like 1856. So it's showing her a little bit older. Despite periods of rapid decline, Whitman remained cheerful and quite ready for death. She passed away on June 27, 1878, at the age of 75. She had requested that no formal announcement of her death be made and no invitations to her funeral be sent out. She believed that her spirit would inform her friends of her death. The Dalys honored these requests, and despite this, a large crowd attended her wake and funeral. So maybe the spiritualism thing really was working out for Sarah Helen Whitman, and she did tell her friends herself that she had passed and invited them to her funeral. Her remains reposed in a white draped coffin adorned with flowers, laurel leaves, and ripened wheat. She looked youthful and beautiful, her brown hair scarcely touched with gray. The service included scripture and a recitation of her poem, The Angel of Death. She was buried next to her sister at the North Burial Ground, with her grave completely covered in greenery and flowers. Though she wished for no marker to mark her final resting place, the Dalys couldn't quite honor that and wanted to erect something to her. And so they compromised with what they called this suitable tablet placed at her grave in her honor. Whitman generously bequeathed money to a black orphanage in Providence, as well as the Rhode Island Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. The Daly daughters each got a sum of $2,500, while the rest of Whitman's money went to the publication of her posthumous edition of poetry. And I like to share this quote from Caroline Tickner, who I think puts it best in her 1916 book titled Poe's Helen, where she describes Whitman's legacy. And she says, quote, "It is a sad injustice to the memory of one of this country's most gifted women to allow her to go down to posterity as merely a charming personage to whom Poe was engaged for a brief time. She was a woman of rare poetic gifts and vivid personality, and her title to fame should rest securely on her own work." End quote. And I really agree with that message. I think it fits Whitman quite well. And of course, Sarah Helen Whitman composed a number of poems dedicated to her relationship with Poe, one of which was originally titled Stanzas for Music and later retitled Our Island of Dreams, was published just shortly after their romance and ultimate breakup. And this poem was published while Poe was still alive. However, he gave no reaction to it or response, if he even saw the poem at all. But that poem goes like this. "Tell him I lingered alone on the shore where we parted in sorrow to meet nevermore. The night wind blew cold on my desolate heart, but colder those wild words of doom, 'You must part?' O'er the dark heaving waters I sent forth a cry. Save the wail of those waters, there came no reply. I longed like a bird o'er the billows to flee from our lone island home in the moan of the sea. Away, far away from the wild ocean shore, where the waves ever murmur no more, nevermore. Where I wake in the wild noon of midnight to hear that lone song of the surges so mournful and drear. When the clouds that now veil from us heaven's fair light, their soft silver lining turn forth on the night. When time shall the vapors of falsehood dispel, he shall know if I loved him, but never how well." So thank you so much for your time today. I'll gladly accept questions if anybody has any. And you're also welcome to take a card up here where you can visit my website at edgarallanpori.com for more information. So thank you so much.